The Sicilian defence with 4 bishop to c5. Side 1. The opening we're going to look at is a line for black in the Sicilian defence. I played it from July 1973 to July 1974 with great success. A measure of its strength is that 2 British champions, Hartston and Botterill, both had 2 attempts to down it, and failed every time. In fact, Hartston even gave up 1 pawn to king 4 against me as a result. In chess, if you want to create anything, you have to have an idea of what you want to do, and you must also have a reasonable positional grounding. You have to find out what sort of positions you like playing, what sort of games would really make your day. And then, if you cannot find what you want in any of the established openings, it's time to invent one. Please set up the position for the start of a game. Switch off if necessary to do so. Now play 1 pawn to e4, black pawn to c5. This opening began with the idea of making a central pawn break. In the ordinary Sicilians, black's central pawn position was nearly always too static. He'd set them up on d6 and e6, castle kingside, and then wait for white to come down the board with pawn to e5 or pawn to f5. The worst thing was that black's longed-for central pawn push, pawn to d5, was hardly ever good because white could reply pawn to e5 and get a good French type of position. Or he could exchange off the queen's pawn and give black an isolated pawn. These are general ideas, of course, just impressions I got about the opening. But you can see too that in the dragon variation, black's pawn structure is generally pretty static. How about livening things up by making a pawn break against white's e-pawn on e4? By pawn break I mean putting one pawn in a position where he is attacking and being attacked by another pawn. The pawn break will demolish a strong point. It will open a line. It can establish which points are valid for placing pieces on. There are very few openings, a few gambits, where pawns are regarded as ballast, getting in the way of pieces. And whenever someone wants to break in, or break out of a position, you always find a pawn break in the offing. Please add the moves to white knight to f3, black pawn to e6, white pawn to d4, black pawn takes on d4, white knight takes on d4. It's a standard Sicilian. Now let's have a look at the position. White has already made a pawn break. He's exchanged his d-pawn for the c-pawn, half opening 2 files. Now his knight on d4 has a half outpost. Black's potentialities for dislodging that knight have decreased. For if at the beginning of the game the d4 square could be, potentially, attacked by 2 black pawns, the e-pawn and the c-pawn, now it can be attacked only by the e-pawn. This, surely, is the essence of the idea of an outpost, a place to go where annoying pawns will not attack you. Now in this position, black will think twice about using up his other option, and playing pawn to e5 to dislodge the white knight, for he then leaves another square indefensible, d5, and white would be looking to place his pieces on that square. In exchange for his half outpost on d4, white has allowed black two half outposts in the centre, at e5 and c5. At the same time, white has no irrevocable weaknesses in his position yet. There is no square from the third rank up which could not be guarded at least once by a pawn. The same cannot be said for black. He has already made a permanent weakness at d6. Now what about the pawn breaks? If you look at the board, you can see that black has, at present, two potential pawn breaks. Pawn to d5 and pawn to f5. Neither of them are good yet, but I began to play with the idea of pushing up the f-pawn. This is always an attractive idea, especially after castling, when you have a rook on f8 ready to occupy an open file. But how are you going to get in pawn to f5 if you've already played a knight to f6, as most people do? The knight blocks the f-pawn. What about developing the knight on h6? That doesn't look too good after white bishop takes on h6, when black's kingside pawns are shattered. Well then, put it on e7. But then the bishop's line is blocked. How are you going to get it out? Either you move the knight again, which you don't necessarily want to do, because this piece is aiming at f5, or you play pawn to g6 and develop the bishop on g7. I didn't feel like doing this, though it is a plan, as long as you play pawn to a6 and stop the white knight going to b5 and then d6. That left bringing out the bishop first and then bringing out the knight onto e7. This was how the opening began. In the position after 4, white knight takes on d4, black plays bishop to c5. This is the start position of the variation, and you might as well commit it to memory, as we will be returning to it frequently. As I was later to discover, Hartston told me, this opening was played 100 years ago in the Morphy-Paulson match by Paulson. Paulson lost every game. But I did not know this at the time. What I did know was that no one ever played it, so I set out trying to discover why. Now bishop c5 is played nowadays, but only after black has played pawn to a6, and white bishop to d3. The difference is that the square d6 is then less easy to exploit. The white knights cannot get to that square in a hurry, and the queen's line has been blocked by the bishop on d3. But before we go any further, let's get a general idea of what I was aiming at with my opening. I said I wanted a pawn break, with black pawn to f5 if possible. But what happens after that? We'd better go through a few variations where white doesn't look too closely at the d6 square, and just carries on with simple development. Make sure the white bishop is back on f1, and the black pawn on a7. After 4, black bishop to c5, the game could develop white knight to b3, black bishop to b6, white knight to c3, black knight to e7, white bishop to d3, black castles, white castles, black knight on b8 to c6, white king to h1. Nice quiet moves. We're following Basman, Woolacombe 1973. Here black plays pawn to f5. Please switch off and look at this position. Now if white plays insipidly, say 10 queen to e2, then black will push on to f4 with his pawn. This is an a1 desirable position for black, for he now has the e5 square all to himself. He can put his knights there, or even his black squared bishop, by bishop to c7 to e5. In a position like this, he would be playing without an opponent, for there is very little that white can do. However, we'll assume that white does not make that positional error, so we place the white queen on d1 and the black pawn on f5. What if white plays pawn takes on f5? And black replies, knight takes on f5. In this case, you have an open position, completely asymmetrical. The state of the pawns will often decide the pattern of the game, and when the pawn structure is symmetrical, the game can become drawish. Here there is no danger of that. What will be the fate of black's two central pawns? Will they be towers of strength, or are they a liability, as modern theory tends to think? It all depends on how much activity is generated by the pieces within the pawn skeleton, how much activity the pawns themselves can generate. Black's pieces, generally, are actively placed. He has one remaining problem, which is the development of the queen's bishop. He may solve it by moving the d pawn or the b pawn. Please switch off and consider which of these pawns you would prefer to move. I think both pawn moves are possible. If black plays pawn to d5, then we get a classical French type of formation. However, black still retains his black squared bishop, so the d4 and e5 squares are not so tender for him. Furthermore, white cannot exploit e5 so easily, since his knights are well offside. Instead of black pawn to d5, black may play bishop to c7, and then develop by pawn to b6, and black bishop to b7. Then the bishop pair will rake down against white's kingside. Let's continue with the game bell in Basman for a little while. Have you got the right position? The black knight on f5 should go back to e7. The black bishops should be on b6 and c8. And the black pawns should be on b7, d7 and f5. A white pawn should be on e4. Here white played pawn to f4, and black exchanged with pawn takes on e4. White recaptured. Knight takes on e4. Please switch off and have a look at the position. I think black had a good move here in pawn to d5. If white then plays knight to g5, attacking the pawn on h7, then simply black pawn to h6. The white knight retreats to f3, and now comes black bishop to c7. Here there is an embarrassing attack on white's f-pawn. White may defend by pawn to g3, but then black pawn to e5, and all black's pieces leap into action. Switch off and study this position for a few moments. Did you notice how easily black broke out with pawn to e5? Now let's return to the position after white knight takes on e4. That means white knight on f3 goes to e4, white pawn on g3 goes back to g2, black bishop on c7 goes to b6, and black pawns back to d7, e6 and h7. Instead of black pawn to d5, black played knight to f5. Now switch off and consider what white's next move should be. White here found a good quintuple purpose move. 13 queen to e1, defending against the threat of black knight to e3. Furthermore, black cannot now play pawn to d5, for white would reply knight to g5, and there is no time for black pawn to h6, because the e6 pawn is under attack. And if instead of black pawn to h6, black plays queen to f6 to guard the e-pawn, white's pawn to g4 puts him in trouble. Please switch off and consider this position. Now we place the black queen on d8, black pawns on h7 and d7, the white knight on g5 goes back to e4, and the white pawn on g4 goes to g2. The third point of 13 white queen to e1 is that black cannot play knight to b4 to exchange off white's powerful bishop on d3. And finally, White stops any hanky-panky black may have had in mind by such moves as queen to h4 and black knight to g3 check. Meanwhile, white has its own threat of pawn to g4 to dislodge the black knight and start a dangerous kingside attack. Black was in a bit of a quagmire here and played pawn to a5, hoping to stick his knight on b4. But white replied rather meekly, pawn to c3. After black pawn to a4, white knight on b3 to d2, black pawn to d5, white knight to g5, black seized his chance with black pawn to e5. Please switch off and consider this position. You see what I mean about the activity which is generated around and by the pawns. White has been unable to restrain them, and here they are, charging down the board. Well, there was no time to waste, and white came forward with 18, pawn to g4, which was answered by black pawn to e4. Now white came up with knight on d2 takes on e4. Black pawn takes on e4, and white queen takes on e4, sacrificing, at least temporarily, a piece for two pawns. After many ups and downs, the game was eventually drawn. You might like to analyze this position and decide what black's next move should be. That is, if you know how to analyze. Do you? Well, let's see how you answer these questions. Do you get bored easily playing over games? Do you find when you play through games that you just make the moves on the board and don't think much about them? Do you feel frustrated when asked to analyze a position, either because you can't calculate all the variations, or just because you can't find any moves? When you analyze by yourself, do you find that your hands take control of you, and that you made 20 moves on the board before you realize what's happened? If you're analyzing with a friend, do you begin to play games together instead of analyzing? And when you actually play a game, do you find yourself going through the same variation over and over again, or that you think for half an hour and find the worst move? If the answer to all these questions is yes, then you're a bad analyst. But if it's any consolation to you, you're no worse than I am. So what are we going to do about it? About this disaster which occurs every time we look at a chess position? Please switch off and consider this question. I think part of the trouble is that people try to run before they can walk. Next time you are faced with a position, such as the one in front of you now, don't try too hard to analyze it. Don't try to work out any moves. Just be aware of the fact that the position is there and that you are looking at it. You will find that even that is not so easy, because your mind is continually jumping about and taking you away from the object you are looking at. But if you can master the knack of gently returning your attention to the position, then you can begin to lay the foundations of analysis. You might like to take a rest here before we go and look at some more lines. The rest of the game, Bell in Basman, can be found in the leaflets supplied. Now let's have a look at the attacks on d6. Please set up the basic position after 4 black bishop to c5, and switch off if necessary while doing so. What about 5 white knight to b5 straight off? Now if black continues calmly with knight to e7, white sticks the boot in with knight to d6 check, black bishop takes on d6, white queen takes on d6. Now this is an undesirable position for black. White occupies the d6 square, and black has lost the bishop that was defending the black squares. So it looks like black should defend d6. Replace the white knight on b5, the white queen on d1, black's bishop on c5, and the black knight on g8. Try black queen to b6. This certainly defends d6, but it has an added perk. The f2 pawn is attacked. Here I could hark back to some remarks made earlier, how pawn structure sets the pattern of the game. I should add that when one player has committed his pawns, the other may find lines and outposts to exploit. For white has weakened the whole of the diagonal, stretching from f2 to b6. His e-pawn has gone to e4, whereas if it were on e3, the black queen and bishop would bite on granite. And when he exchanged d and c pawns, he also got rid of a potential line blocker. Let's say white carries on his attack by 6 white bishop to f4. The threat is knight to d6 check, or even better, knight to c7 check, winning a rook. But I think black has a defense. You might like to try and find it. Switch off. Have you found it? Good. Let's go on to the next line. Instead of 6 white bishop to f4, try white queen to g4. This is a good ploy when black's bishop has left home. It might work here. Black has various defences. King to f8, pawn to g6, black knight to e7, or bishop takes on f2 check. Which do you consider is the best? You might like to try out your analytical powers on this position. Switch off. If you've had a look at the lines arising from white queen to g4, we could go back to the basic position after 4 black bishop to c5 and look at some more instant crunch lines. Switch off while you're setting it up. Instead of 5 white knight to b5, white can try 5 bishop to e3. This once again cuts across black's plans. What does white do if black plays 5 knight to e7? Switch off. Yes, folks, he plays knight takes on e6, attacking queen and bishop. After black pawn on f7 takes on e6, white bishop takes on c5, and white's a pawn up, and black's lost his lovely black squared bishop. So replace the white bishop on e3, the white knight on d4, black's knight on g8, black's bishop on c5, and black pawns on f7 and e6. It looks like 5 black queen to b6 again, though there are other possible moves. Now the queen also attacks the b pawn. Perhaps you would like to answer this question. Can black take the b pawn after, say, white knight to c3? Switch off. Have you answered the question? Well, even if you haven't, you can look at it later. Let's go back a move. Put the white knight on c3 back onto b1. Black's queen move to b6 has intensified the pressure on the diagonal leading to f2. He will probably play black knight to c6 next move to attack the d4 square again. Before we consider white's main moves in this position, you might like to look at a sideline in 6 white knight to d2. This threatens 7 knight to c4, striking at the queen. Switch off. Have you looked at it? Good. Let's go on to the next variation. Please put the white knight on d2 back onto b1. Here comes white's next attempt. 6 white knight to b5. This was played against me by Howard Williams at the Woolacombe International Tournament, October 1973, and drew a gasp of horror from the assembled Ray Keane, who remarked afterwards that white's black squares looked a lot weaker than black's during the game. I must admit, it surprised me as well, but then d6 is a pretty attractive looking square. I played 6 black bishop takes on e3. White knight went to d6 check. Black king to f8. White pawn takes on e3. And now black queen takes on e3 check. Actually, it's a bit of a toss-up whether to take the pawn or not. The important factor for black in this position is that the square e5 has been turned from a half into a whole outpost, due to the absence of the f-pawn. The next moves were white bishop to e2, black knight to c6. Now it's time to switch off and take stock of the position. White has achieved his objective in planting a piece at d6, and he has also dislodged the black king. He can place a rook at f1, and together with the knight they will make a combined attack on f7. And what about black's miserable undeveloped queenside pieces? The bishop on c8, the rook on a8. All this for only a pawn? What more could a man want? As it turned out, however, it didn't take long for white's position to fall apart. The possession of the e5 square made black's game impenetrable. A few months later, at Hastings, a similar assault was made on d6, this time by Bill Hardston. There were, however, a couple of differences in the position. The first was that white had already developed his queen's knight, so put a white knight on c3. The second, and far more important, was that he had delayed the occupation of the d6 square, so put the white knight on d6 back onto b5. Here white played rook to f1, and I had a choice between black knight on g8 to e7 or black knight to f6. Please switch off and consider which move you would choose. I played black knight to f6, which gave white his chance. Queen to d6 check. Black king to g8. Now how would you continue for white? Switch off here. After 40 minutes careful thought, white came up with rook takes on f6. Black has to take. Pawn takes on f6. White rook to d1. Black pawn to h5. Please switch off and consider the position. Black's last move, pawn to h5, was necessary on a number of counts. It gives the king some air, lets the rook out, and the pawn is going to h4 to guard the g3 square. Otherwise, white's rook would move to d3 and then to g3, giving check. In the magazine Chess for January 1974, Hardston published an analysis to show he was winning and just transposed moves. I'm not so sure. Certainly black's game is critical, but he finds a way out. White played 14, rook to d3. Black queen to c1 check. White king to f2. Black pawn to h4. White knight to c7. You might like to consider how white would continue if black played rook to b8 here. Switch off. White answers black rook to b8 by white knight to e8, attacking the pawn on f6. Black defends by rook to h6, and then white rook to f3. Black queen to g5. Now how does white increase the pressure on f6? Switch off and find a move. White smashes in with knight to d5. Black pawn takes on d5. And now, instead of white knight takes on f6 check, white has a very strong move here. Rook to f5. Black queen goes back to g6, and then white bishop to h5. Turn off the cassette here and consider the position. Black may well be lost after white's bishop to h5. This variation, with the sacrifice of the knight at d5, may give you an idea of white's possibilities in this line. Now let's go back to the game. That means white rook on f5 goes back to d3. The white knights go to c7 and c3. The white bishop goes back to e2. A black queen on c1, and black rooks on h8 and a8. The black pawn on d5 should go to e6. In view of the last variation, how would you continue for black? Switch off. Black played knight to e5, not bothering to defend the rook on a8. Then came knight takes on a8. Black queen to f4 check. White king to g1. Black knight takes on d3. White queen takes on d3. And now it's time to switch off and take stock of the position. White's got two pieces against a rook and pawn, and should be able to get his knight out. But such is the solidity of black's central position that he is hardly losing. In fact, I was quite surprised when later on that evening Suttles pointed out the move 19, queen to b8, to knock off the knight. Even though black's queen ends up on the unearthly a8 square, it seems that the best white can do is draw. However, instead of black queen to b8, I played black pawn to b6, which was not bad, and now the sleeping beauty, the bishop on c8, is coming into the game. White played 20 queen to c4. Black bishop to b7. White knight to c7. And after black queen to e3 check, white king to f1, black queen to f4 check. The contestants were happy to agree a draw, a result I had been after since move 1, since this put me within half a point of the IM norm. I didn't in fact make the IM norm, which probably serves me right for agreeing quick draws. After the game, I told Bill that 10, black knight on g8 to e7 was crushing, and what was he going to do about it? He said that I couldn't expect him to reveal his private analysis at this stage, a remark that surprised me. Did he really intend playing the variation again? He did. A fortnight later in the British Championship playoff match, we got into the same position after White's 10th move. This time I did put my knight on e7, and won the game after many adventures. After the experience of these two games, Harston abandoned one pawn to e4, and went over to one pawn to d3 against me. He won all those games. Sicilian with 4, bishop c5. Side 2. Please have the pieces set up for the start of a game. Switch off to do so if you're not ready yet. Now play the moves 1, pawn to e4, black pawn to c5, white knight to f3, black pawn to e6, white pawn to d4, black pawn takes on d4, white knight takes on d4, black bishop to c5. So far we've looked at attacks on d6 by white knight to b5 and white bishop to e3. However, there is another line stemming from the sequence 5, white bishop to e3, black queen to b6, white knight to c3, black knight to c6. A possibility here is 7, white knight to a4, as was played against me by George Botterill in the London Invitation Tournament of September 1973. Black must play queen to a5 check. And now, if the partners want to draw, they can go white knight to c3, black queen to b6, white knight to a4, black queen to a5 check, and so on. But what if they want to win? Botterill played 8, white pawn to c3, and I replied, black bishop takes on d4, white bishop takes on d4, black knight takes on d4, white queen takes on d4, black knight to f6. This is a crucial position. Please switch off and study it a while. Black is cramped, and his bishop on c8 doesn't look too good yet. At the same time, white's knight on a4 could be offside. As the game was quite interesting, I'll go through it in detail. White pushed on straight away with pawn to e5, and the sequel was black knight to d5, white knight to c5, black castles, white bishop to c4, black knight to e7. Please switch off again here. This retreat with the knight was very uncomfortable for white, because it can now go to either c6 or f5. And white's king pawn is looking weak. So white played bishop to d3, at least to stop black's knight to f5. Black now brought his knight round to c6, and white played an interesting finesse, queen to e3. Please switch off and consider what the point of it was. The thing is, were white to play queen to e4 immediately, threatening mate on h7, then black replies pawn to g6, and white cannot move the knight, since his e-pawn would fall. So he must play white pawn to b4. Then black could drop his queen back to c7, and what with the attack on the e-pawn, the threat of pawn to b6 and black bishop to b7, and white's weak pawn on c3, he would have a lovely game. So white intends that the queen at least shall not go back to c7. The game still goes against him, though. Have you got the right position after 15 white queen to e3? The white queen should be on e3, the white b pawn on b2, the black queen on a5, and the black g pawn on g7, and the black b pawn on b7, bishop on c8. Black now played pawn to b6. Here there was an interesting move for white in pawn to b4, which you might like to look at. Please switch off. Have you looked at it? Let's carry on. Instead of white pawn to b4, white played queen to e4. The next moves were more or less forced. Black pawn to g6, white pawn to b4, black queen to a3, white knight to b3, black bishop to b7, white queen to e2. Please switch off and consider the position once again. You can see what the result of the square battle has been. The white knight wanted to go to e4 and the black queen to c7. Both pieces have ended up on the side of the board. Here black played pawn to a5, after which he was well on his way, because the threat of pawn to a4 is going to win the c pawn. The next moves were white pawn to b5, black knight to e7, white castles. Please switch off and consider black's next move in this position. Black's knight to d5 would have left white almost defenseless, due to the double threats of knight to f4 and knight takes on c3. Black's actual move, replace the black knight on e7, was pawn to a4. Far too hasty. He wins a pawn, but his queen gets pushed all over the place. The next moves were white knight to d2, black queen takes on c3, white rook on a1 to c1, black queen to d4, white rook to c4, black queen to d5. Switch off again here. As you can see, black's queen has scarcely a square left. Although he threatens mate on the move, it's rather fortunate that white can't play bishop to e4 here, because his e-pawn would be on prise. During the game, I was rather afraid that white would prepare bishop to e4 by pawn to f4, guarding the e-pawn. You might like to consider sometime whether that would have been more dangerous. Let's continue with the game. The white bishop should be on d3, and the white f-pawn should be on f2. White played 25 knight to f3, and black snatched off the b-pawn. Queen takes on b5. White moved knight to g5, and black returned with pawn to f5. Both sides are now swaying about in a timed scramble, so the quality of the play begins to deteriorate around here. White moved his rook to d1, a good one. Black returned his queen to d5, once again threatening mate. White plays bishop to e4. Black, queen takes on e5, a blunder. White moves, rook takes on d7, another blunder. Black takes on e4 with the f-pawn, and white takes the knight on e7 with his rook. Now came black bishop to a6, a killer. White has no good reply. He played knight takes on h7, and after queen to a1 check, white resigned. After that little interlude, I think we can look at some more attempts by white to cash in on d6. One of them has never occurred in play, or at least not against me. It turned out that one of my pupils, the other one is now in Ireland, began playing the bishop c5 line on my recommendation, and kept losing with it. I asked him why, and he said that every time white got a knight on d6 and strangled him. He showed me the line. Please have the position ready after 4 black bishop to c5. Switch off if necessary to do so. Now play white knight to b3, black bishop to b6, white knight to c3, black knight to e7, white knight to b5, black castles, white knight to d6. I told him that no strong player would ever play that line, because he would be afraid of prepared analysis. That was why I hadn't looked at it yet. Now can black take advantage of the 2 moves white has spent getting his knight to d6? Switch off and consider this problem. Try black knight on b8 to c6, white pawn to f4. Now black's pawn to f5 is answered quite happily by white pawn to e5. So replace black's pawn on f7 and white's e-pawn on e4. Black could play it slowly by queen to c7, followed by pawn to a6, bishop to a7, and pawn to b5. White is not without development problems himself, for his queen must remain tied to the knight at d6, and white's pawn to e5 can always be happily answered by pawn to f6. Furthermore, black could play an immediate pawn to f5 instead of knight on b8 to c6. Please replace the black knight on b8, the black queen on d8, the black bishop on b6, and the black pawns on a7 and b7, and put the white pawn on f2. Now play black pawn to f5. If white moves pawn to e5, black pawn to f4 cuts the e-pawn from its supporter on the f-file. Please switch off and consider this position. White will have a hard time defending the pawn on e5, because both black knights can attack it almost immediately. Finally, after 7 white knight to b5, you can always chicken out by black pawn to d5. A far more dangerous attempt at refutation was presented by the Dutch Grandmaster, then a master, Jan Timman, when we met at Hastings 1974. In fact, this was the only game I lost with the line, and it had me reeling for at least a day. Please set up the position after 4 black bishop to c5. Switch off if necessary. Now play white knight to b3, black bishop to b6, white knight to c3, black knight to e7, white bishop to f4. black castles, and white bishop to d6. Please switch off here to orientate yourself. The strength of this move lies in the fact that the bishop itself controls a lot of important black squares, and that there is a pin on the knight at e7. So when black plays pawn to f5, and white plays, say, pawn takes on f5, black cannot reply knight takes on f5, and may have to recapture with the rook, which is not so good. Please replace the knight on e7, the black pawn on f7, and the white pawn on e4. I played here black pawn to f5 straight away, and after some thought, white replied pawn to e5. Black played knight on b8 to c6, and white moved queen to d2. Here black played pawn to f4, preparing to surround the king pawn, and white castled queenside. Perhaps you might switch off and consider what moves black should play in this position. Black played 11 rook to f7 to break the pin, and the next moves were white bishop to d3, black knight to f5, white rook on h1 to e1, black queen to h4, white knight to e4. By this time I was beginning to feel that all was not well, and that white was noisily strangling me. I played bishop to d8, hoping to be able to play pawn to b6 next move. But white pushed me back with 15 pawn to g3, black queen to h6, white pawn takes on f4. Please switch off and consider what you would play here. In view of the threat of white knight to g5, black could find nothing better than knight takes on d6. White knight takes on d6, and black rook takes on f4. Black has, it is true, regained his pawn, but the second inhabitant of the d6 square is even more deadly than the first. I won't go through the rest of the game, but suffice it to say that black was massacred. He never got his queenside pieces out, and he lost his queen as well. As you can imagine, after this experience I was pretty groggy, and thought the whole line was a load of rubbish for black. Timon seemed to think I should avoid the bishop d6 line altogether, by playing black pawn to d5 on move 7. However, later analysis showed that things were not so bad for black. Please return to the position after white castled queenside on move 11. Switch off and refer to the game in the leaflet if you can't remember it. When I played black rook to f7 and knight to f5, I was mistakenly trying to attack the bishop on d6. What I should have been doing was attacking the pawn on e5, by, for example, bishop to c7. If now white rook to e1, then even black pawn to b6. The point is that white can never play knight to e4, because he loses the e-pawn. But there is an even better move than black pawn to b6. Black can play knight to g6, giving up the exchange, after which he wins the e-pawn and has a crushing game. If you don't believe it, play it out with a friend. Black's central pawn mass and black's squared bishop well outweigh the lost exchange. Turn off the cassette a few moments and consider this position. The exchange sack by knight to g6 can be played immediately, before black bishop to c7, that is. Missing the right continuation, I went down to defeat. However, I was in good company. In the Morphy-Paulsen match, Paulsen lost in almost the same way. Source of information, Hardston. If this line is so good for black, we might try and find improvements for white earlier on. Please return to the position after black's ninth move this time. Switch off and refer to the leaflet if necessary. Now what if white plays pawn to f4 instead of queen to d2? Please switch off and look for a black move. Let's try it. Black pawn to g5. White pawn takes on g5, and black knight to g6. It looks crazy. The exchange is one thing, but to shatter your own kingside as well. Surely black is going too far. Or is he? Turn off the cassette in order to analyze this position. The game may go white bishop takes on f8, black king takes on f8, white queen to d2 to guard the pawn on g5 and prepare castling. Black plays knight on c6, takes on e5. White castles queenside, and black plays knight to g4, threatening knight to f2 and bishop to e3. Turn off the cassette and study this position. Perhaps white could avoid this line by delaying castling. Replace the white rook on a1 and the white king on e1. Put black's knights on g6 and e5. White could here try bishop to e2, stopping black knight to g4. There are some funny lines in this position. The first move that springs to mind is black pawn to f4, which once again stops white from castling. But there is, instead of black pawn to f4, black knight to f7, hitting the G pawn. White defends by pawn to H4, and now switch off and consider how you would continue. Black could play here bishop to C7, once again stopping white castling, and threatening a check on G3. And if white defends by rook to H3, then knight to H4 is possible. So white's pawn push to E5 leads to a lot of wild lines. He may feel that he'd prefer a quieter life. If so, he has an alternative. Please return to the position after black's 8th move in the game Basman. Switch off if necessary. Here white could exchange on F5, but perhaps stronger is queen to D2. This guards against black pawn to F4, and black pawn takes on E4 can be answered by white knight takes on E4, guarding the F2 pawn. Replace the white knight on C3, the black pawn on F5, and the white pawn on E4. Let's say black plays knight on B8 to C6, and white castles queenside. Now how would you continue for black? Switch off. I think if black is to make any progress, he has to play bishop to C7. After white bishop takes on C7, black queen takes on C7, white pawn takes on F5, black knight takes on F5, white pawn to F4, black pawn to D5, the game will take on the character of a French defense, though with more activity than usual in the position for black. Certainly, these positions require investigation. Black too has his options. Should he play knight on B8 to C6 before pawn to F5, or vice versa? Or should he avoid the bishop to D6 line altogether, as Timon suggested? These are questions for the future. Meanwhile, since you've been working so hard, I think you deserve a rest here, before we look at the last game. One of the advantages of the 4 bishop to C5 line is that it starts so soon. What happens though if white nonetheless does manage to avoid it? I don't mean by playing one pawn to D4. Please set up the pieces for the start of a game. In the British Championship 1973, after one pawn to E4, black pawn to C5, white knight to F3, black pawn to E6, Hutchins played 3 white knight to C3, and I was rather nonplussed. Obviously, there was no way of getting into the bishop C5 line now. I played black pawn to A6, and after white pawn to G3, the game took on a closed character. A few months later, at Hastings, Adorjan, the Hungarian GM, played the same sequence of moves, but instead of 4 pawn to g3, he opened up the game with 4 white pawn to d4. This game was interesting because it showed different aspects of the same theme. The basic theme being bringing out the black bishop, then the knight, and then moving the f-pawn. Here the black bishop came out early, but it wandered round the queen side for a little while before settling on the a7, f2 diagonal. The black pawn also moved, but this time only as far as f6, where it reinforced the centre and supported the knight on e5. Apart from a blemish on move 22, the game represents a composite whole. It seems fitting that the decisive blow should be dealt by the black bishop along the a7 f2 diagonal, with the sleeping beauty from c8 and the black knight on e5 both contributing to the final onslaught. It was a game that really made my day. After white's fourth move, pawn to d4, black played pawn takes on d4. White knight takes on d4. Black queen to c7, turning the game into a sort of Paulsen variation. If that name seems familiar to you, you might consider that this was the next line Paulsen tried after getting beaten up on d6 by Morphy. White played 6, pawn to g3, black bishop to b4, white knight on d4 to e2. Black knight to c6, white bishop to g2, black knight on g8 goes to e7, white castles and black castles, white knight to f4. Please switch off and consider this position. Black played pawn to f6. Moving this pawn to f5 would here be rather premature, as it only serves to open white's bishop's diagonal. The game continued. White knight to d3, black bishop to a5, white knight to e2, once and for all removing black's threat to double his c-pawns, and intending pawn to c4. Black prevented this by pawn to b5, and white moved pawn to b3. Please switch off and consider the position. Black played rook to f7. This move looks rather peculiar, but as black is not directly threatened, he can afford to strengthen his position. White now played bishop to b2, black rook to b8, white rook to c1, black bishop to b6. By a roundabout method, the bishop has eventually got back onto the f2, b6 diagonal. White advanced pawn to c4. Black pawn takes on c4. White pawn takes on c4. This pawn capture is very committal, and it might have been better to keep the queenside pawns intact by rook takes on c4. Black now occupied the key outpost by knight to e5. White played pawn to c5. Black bishop to a7. Please switch off and consider the position. White played knight on e2 to f4. Black pawn to a5. White queen to c2. Black bishop to a6. White rook on f1 goes to d1. Black knight on e7 goes to c6. White bishop to a1. How would you now continue as black? Switch off here. Black's pieces have been slowly maneuvering onto ideal squares. Only his rook on f7 is disconnected from the main body of the army. So he might have considered rook on f7 to f8, followed by rook on f8 to c8, increasing the pressure on the c-pawn. Instead of this maneuver, he played knight to b4. White played knight takes on b4, and black played rook takes on b4. Now what should white play here? Switch off. White here had an opportunity to stem the tide with white bishop to c3. Then the intended rook to c4 would fail to white bishop to f1. So instead of rook to c4, black would have had to have gone rook to b8, and white might breathe again. Now replace the black rook on b4 and the white bishops on a1 and g2. White actually played pawn to c6, liquidating a weakness but also bringing all black's pieces into the attack. Things now happened fast. Black played rook to c4. White pawn takes on d7. Black rook takes on d7. White rook takes on d7. Black queen takes on d7. White bishop to c3. Black bishop to d4. White knight goes to e2. How would you now continue for black? Switch off here. Black played bishop takes f2 check. White king takes on f2. Black queen to a7 check. White king to e1. Black knight to g4. White blocked with knight to d4. Black rook takes on d4. White bishop takes on d4. Black queen takes on d4. White here moved queen to c5. And black threatened mate with queen to d3. White defended rook to c2. Black knight to e3. White rook to d2. Black knight takes on g2 check, and white resigned.